Tanzania, East Africa, to begin our ministry years. Some health needs with our then youngest child brought us back to the States a bit earlier than we intended, but we came back, settled into being a youth pastor. I was a youth pastor for several churches for about a decade, and as full-time work. And the churches that we worked, that we grew up in, were a little more rural, suburban, evangelical, really conservative churches down in Texas. And so we worked for churches in Texas and in Alabama. Towards the end of my time, about half my time as a youth pastor, I was working with non-denominational churches, and with one, the University Christian Church next to Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. I did an interim work for them. Was one of the last things I did before I came out to Bethesda. During that time, spiritually, so I had outgrown a lot of that evangelical theology and ecclesiology pretty early on. But you know, it's difficult to leave the church you grew up in, right? You love it, you love the people, you have connections. And I had also become involved with the Emergent church conversation. So like author Brian McLaren, Tony Jones, and some of those different names and characters around the country. I was called out to Bethesda, Maryland in 2007 to restart an Emergent church, which had been a restart and failed. And so that brought us out. We moved out to Bethesda in 2007 with our 3 boys. And here we are today. I was there for about 8.5 years, almost 9 years, to restart that church, build it up, grow it into a church of the community. Like a lot of churches, it had become a church from outside the Beltway. Everybody drove in from as far away as Greenbelt and Germantown and all these places. And so worked in that time to rebuild the leadership and the core of the church and get it going. In that time, I had always been what they called an ancient faith emergent. So I went through my couple of years where I primarily studied personally Orthodox theology and Eastern works and ancient things. For about 7 years, I had a spiritual director down in Georgetown at Holy Trinity Parish. He was a Jesuit priest from Baltimore, Father Leo Murray, and really formed my growing and maturing spiritual life as an adult within the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, and got to know folks in the Episcopal diocese, and got to know the bishop, and got to know, was invited in to help with a couple of events. I'm an artist. And so one of the first things I did with the diocese was live painting during a young adult event down at St. Margaret's at DuPont Circle. And that's where we met the bishop for the first time and got to know some of the folks in the diocese. Realized I was satelliting the diocese from then on in a couple of different ways. And, you know, you get a little older, you read a little too much Richard Rohr, you start thinking second half of life, what am I going to do with it? And we decided to move into a denomination, for lack of a better term or way to put it. You know, we loved our church, our congregation, but it wasn't connected to a larger church family officially. And so we got to looking around for ones that resonated with our core values and the things that really mattered to us. And so we landed in the Episcopal Church. And today I work, when I was made a deacon, June 15th in 2019. 2 days later, I went to work on the bishop's staff and have been a missioner ever since. I work today primarily in revitalization. So I did a lot of work last year leading the effort to gather leaders, put together those vital signs you've probably heard about, and some of the supporting metrics and things like that. Some of the early webinar offerings we did last year as the School of Christian Faith and Leadership got launched. And then we're doing some Tuesday lunches right now around the vital signs, interviewing a lot like this and panel discussion. And also support young adult ministries and our campus ministries in parts of the diocese. And personally, I'm really excited. I did a year of inquiry and a year of postulancy, and I've been accepted as a novice into the Anglican Order of Preachers. So I'm actually going to the chapter meeting in Puerto Rico in August to be made a novice in the Anglican Dominican. So pretty excited about that, and glad to be with you today.
Thank you. That's a fascinating story. So We often hear that evangelical and non-denominational congregations are doing a good job of connecting with unchurched people in our community.
Mhm.
What's your sense of who some of the strongest churches of this kind are in this area and what they're doing especially well?
Right. Um, so the strong churches around the area, and honestly, you can Google this and do a lot of the same work. You know, you've got a couple of different things happening. I think you've got the more Bible church kind of based evangelical megachurch groups, which are operating around. I made some notes here, like Church of the Redeemer and McLean Bible. We all know those names. Some of the largest churches around, though, in the DC area, tend to often be Baptist churches, Pentecostal churches, primarily African American, based in their constituency. Whereas McLean Bible and Church of the Redeemer tend to be a little bit different, much wider, suburban, and often spread out. So instead of having a big sort of mega church idea, you may have that, but then you've got satellite locations around. So they really kind of work out to have multiple locations and multiple location churches. Um, and I was chatting with my wife about it. You know, we're going to have to talk in a lot of generalities here,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
a lot of wide kind of expressions here. Across the board with those churches, we were talking about what really is the difference between them and say some of our Episcopal churches, because you know the Episcopal Church has a very incarnational kind of mindset for churches and church planting. We haven't really embraced the multiple site with a parent church idea. No, just plant a church over there, you know, put a church in that neighborhood. And then we come together, we incarnate around the table. And I think by and large, we have to talk about experience and the experience of worship and gathering within those churches and the Episcopal Church. If you think of Westerhoff's model of the stages of faith, you know, you go from experience to belonging, to a searching kind of break phase to an ownership. And what Westerhoff was saying there is that most of the time when we're church, when we come to faith, we have an experience and it's a moving experience. And we like it and we come back for more. And then we move into belonging, or what I think he called affiliated faith. And we say, this is where I am. This, you know, this is my people. I found my place. But typically, as we go through that faith journey, something happens that causes a break for us, or it causes us to search. And out of that process, we end up at an owned faith, you know, because foundations are broken. We really have to dig in and find out, what is it I believe about God? What is it I believe about this and my faith? And we come out stronger for it. A lot of these churches do so well at that experiential place. You show up and you have an experience, and probably you want to repeat it. Let's just be honest. The music is fantastic. Greeter ministries are on point with you. They may even have swag and logos, and it's like immediately you feel like there's something happening here. There's there's an energy to that experience. There is a connection with that experience, and um, I hate the word relevant or relevancy, because it can kind of give a little bit of a negative connotation sometimes, you know, two ways. Relevancy can sound like we're just on the latest fad and we do the latest thing. So we have a Starbucks in the lobby or something like that. And it also sounds a little demeaning for God, because God's a little bit above relevancy, right? As our God. But relevancy as accessibility and connection, relevancy as efficacy. You know, you drop into a lot of these churches and the sermons are actually super applicable right then, right there that day. The sermon, and some of this has to do with lectionary and not lectionary and different things like that. But the messages in those churches tend to be sort of on point. They tend to be applicable. They tend to be timely, apropos to what's going on, applicable. They can adjust and move pretty quickly and adapt to things that are happening, to really make those connection points, to make it accessible. So relevancy in the best way to think of that word, that it is actually it's a true intersection. I'm not withdrawing from life to go to church. but I'm actually going to a point of intersection in faith and what is going on in the rest of my life. I don't leave it at the door. I bring it in, and it's a part of what we're talking about. It's a part of our vocabulary. So there's a lot of accessibility there within that experience. And finally, invitation. These typically, the churches which are growing, they tend to talk about inviting people to church. They tend to stress that. And so the church in Bethesda where I was, yeah, I remember within my first year there, I was kind of looking back at some of the history. And we mentioned when we were chatting before the meeting today, historically, it had been a Baptist church. And they dropped the Baptist affiliation, kind of went to a multi-denominational or a non-denominational thing, which is where we were at when I was there. But I remember going through the old church bulletins one time, and I had started looking at, they had attendance numbers from the previous week in each week's bulletin. So I was looking and I was mapping attendance and people being added in baptisms and things. And the first thing I did was I charted all that out so I could see the years that it grew and the years it didn't. And then we all have these pat general reasons for when churches grew and when they don't, and cultural reasons. But I went through and looked at the sermon titles, the passages that were in the bulletins, the topics that were being talked about. And those growing years, it was amazing. They talked about evangelism. They talked about inviting people to church. They talked about sharing faith. And when that was what the church was focused on, the church grew. And then in later years, when they didn't talk about that stuff, the church didn't grow. And that's not the only thing going on in those situations. But when you primarily have an invitational people, of people whose faith experience and church experience really values and continues to talk about, invite people. Don't drag them in. Don't put them in an arm lock. Don't condemn them first. You don't have to just invite them. Say, well, why don't you come and do this with me? This is happening. I love my preacher. I love my priest. You should meet him. We have the best coffee. You might not. Don't lie about that. I've been there. But, just say, come on in and meet some folks. We're doing this. The men are cooking out. You know what? We're Episcopalians, so we have beers while we're cooking out. And let people know that there are communities and things happening to which you'd love them to be exposed.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. Thank you. So sort of the three things are kind of a really kind of dynamic, high quality experience, and then sort of relevance and accessibility, and then really talking about inviting people and encouraging, building up a culture of invitation.
Right. And, I didn't say it had to be this style of worship or this type, because these churches are different, from McLean Bible to Church of the Redeemer to, what was the other big one I was looking at? A big Pentecostal, Temple of Praise. They're going to be very different worship experiences.
Yeah.
And yet there's going to be engagement. There's going to be participation. There's going to be things tailored to audiences to really speak to them in special ways.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. So when you were leading the church in Bethesda, were many of the people who came to you unchurched or de-churched people, or were they mostly people who were just moving from one congregation to another? And then if, as a follow-up, if they were kind of unchurched or de-churched, what did you observe about their spiritual needs and desires, and what would they say drew them into your congregation?
Yeah, I really wrestle with this question a little bit with unchurched and dechurched, because as I think back on it, we became a fairly good crosscut of Bethesda in those years, from 2007 to 2015, the end of 2015 when I left, the beginning of 2016. In that we were fairly monocultural. We were very suburban Bethesda with racial diversity, but we all tended to have a lot of the same background, same career, same jobs, same paths in many parts of life. So we had Korean, we had Chinese, African American, white. Our folks came from a lot of different church backgrounds. So we would often have both that unchurched and dechurched at the same time. A couple comes in because a Baptist married a non-believer, a Presbyterian married an Orthodox, a Catholic married a Jew. was super common to meet those folks in downtown Bethesda coming to church for the first time, coming to church with us for the first time. But in fact, not having been able to land anywhere, find a place that really sort of gave them connection points within a community, so that even if there were things that were not a part of their cultural background or their faith journey so far, they found something to grab onto and were able then to experience some new things too. And this is something I felt we had in common with the Episcopal Church in many ways, you know, with that via media, with that standing with a foot in a couple of different worlds at one time, in the sense that we heard from folks a lot when they came to us. Wow, you know, I'm Presbyterian and my spouse is Lutheran. And we each resonated with something that happened in the worship. It was a prayer, it was a musical piece, it was the preaching, it was, we celebrated the Eucharist every Sunday. And, you know, so there were these touch points that people from even diverse marriages and diverse families found different ways to connect and handhold. I often talked about it as the metaphor of virology. You know, what we do when we craft things to fight viruses is we look at the receptors on the virus, right? And like a puzzle piece, we craft a protein or something, a blocker that will automatically fit into one of the receptors on that virus. So for me, church was like that. I'm looking around downtown Bethesda. I'm looking at the people who walk by the church every day. I'm getting to know them in community meetings. We're hosting film screening for the communities, free concerts, different things. I'm getting to know them. What are their receptors? What are their backgrounds? And how can we at least have one thing that intentionally is going to speak to a Catholic when they visit us, that's going to speak to a Baptist, that's going to make the Jewish spouse feel really welcome, that's going to help. We often had our Muslim neighbors would visit because their daughter went off to college, converted to Christianity to marry her boyfriend. So they said, can we come to church? Because we don't know anything about Christianity. And it's like, yeah. And you know, where they landed with us during our Eucharistic celebration, we celebrated intinction, you know, tearing away a piece of bread, dipping in the cup. We always used fresh breads from across the street at the farmer's market. And I really miss that, but after you receive the bread and cup, you would go and make art or put together a service project. We had tables spread out around, there's music playing, and we would paint together, or we would assemble gifts for the kids at NIH and these different things. And that's where our Muslim neighbors would come and create art to send to their daughter who had become a Christian. And we're so excited about it. So it was, trying to find a way that we engaged everybody when they walked in. The unchurched folks tended to be Jewish spouses, to be, really honest, within Bethesda. But the de-churched were often what I would call unchurched, in the sense that they were church, but somebody unchurched them, usually in a painful, painful, jolting way. So we had a lot of folks come to us for healing, which I haven't really seen. I've talked to a lot of ex-Catholics or past practicing Catholics who ended up in the Episcopal Church. They tend to not carry in the damage that some of the evangelicals do, because there are a lot of rough edges and sharp points in those churches that if you run afoul of them, there's not a lot of room to navigate around those sharp edges.
Interesting. I wanted to ask you about this question of former evangelicals. This came up in a conversation we had 2 weeks ago with our former seminarian who's leading a religious community for young adults in Arizona. But this is also your experience, at least as you've said, that you kind of came out of an evangelical background. You were still a committed Christian, but there was something that drew you into the Episcopal Church.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what I think, and we certainly have people in our congregation who are from a similar background. I wouldn't say it's a big number of people. So I think we're maybe still trying to get our head around this a little bit. But for people in this, with this kind of background, what might be especially attractive to them about the Episcopal Church, and what would be hard for them about our church?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I want to make sure I have my notes open for that one too. Now part of it is, it's different for everybody. Um, Part of it was my ancient faith bent, that I was looking to Orthodox theology, to understand the incarnation. I was looking to Jesuit practice for my spirit, my spirituality. So I'm looking myself backwards anyway. I remember we went to a newcomers class at St. John's Norwood when we started our journey into the Episcopal Church, and we were there for several years. They were my sponsoring parish. And we went to a newcomers class. And they're like, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Apostolic succession." And Father Seri over there was like, "What are you even talking about?" I'm like, "But I want to be honest. I'm a geek. I'm a church geek, and apostolic succession meant a lot to me."
Sure.
Now, the things that got the Episcopal Church on my list as an ex-evangelical tend to be a lot of the things that don't exist within the evangelical church. The prayer book is amazing. I think the prayer book is one of the greatest gifts that we have to our fellow Christians and to one another today. I loved it. I had been collecting prayer books since my days in seminaries as an evangelical, and didn't know anything about the Episcopal Church, but I knew that I could access things in that prayer book a lot easier. Like the collect. Thank you for that collect you opened with today. That's my favorite one from morning prayer. It's one of the three you pray if you're not celebrating the Eucharist. And I love the imagery of that one. I wear the Tau cross that St. Francis loved, because it looked like a monk with open arms. That ancient faith, that reaching back in, the rhythm of the liturgy, the rhythm of the daily hours is much needed. And you see many evangelical churches mimicking the liturgical year today, at least the high points, right? And they're rediscovering some of the sacraments and some of the sacramental nature of Christian life and the power of that. That all drew me in. And I will say that middle way of Anglican theology is super important. Coming out of evangelical Christianity, you walk a tight wire. In many of those churches, every issue becomes a salvation issue. There's very little room for nonconformity when it comes to doctrinal issues or hermeneutical issues, understanding exegetical issues of interpreting scripture. You end up crashed on the rocks pretty quick in that system if you ask questions, if you want to change things. So I was looking for a church with more diversity in theological expressions and doctrinal expressions, and found that in the Episcopal Church. I also was looking for a church that was committed to human rights, that was committed to the LGBTQ community, that was nationally on the scene, promoting people's dignity and sort of giving the counter image to the evangelical one, which is very anti-people, whether it is their failure to really embrace the call of anti-racism and or the situation on the immigration situation down on the border, which continues to just be so problematic. If it is all these things in ways, and especially the vociferous hatred for people who are different from them. Coming to a church that openly stands for something else, that leans into those amazing baptismal promises of supporting people's dignity, working for justice. That was all important for me. And I think that openness, that diversity is what I have seen others. So I was a youth pastor for 5 years in Montgomery, Alabama, which was not an enlightened area of the country necessarily, as far as my way of thinking about the world and politics and life and church. Super conservative church, super traditional church. You just didn't rock the boat anyway at all. And I've been amazed through the years. And of course, I left there in 2005. But the number of kids from my youth ministry who have ended up in the Episcopal Church, it almost always has to do because they fell afoul of some doctrinal point with the evangelical churches that we were in. And you cannot do that. You must conform. And so to find a place where you can kind of buck the trend, or find a place where people think like you, at least some, is super important and different for a lot of evangelical Christians.
Huh. And what is hard for folks like that, like your former youth leaders, your former youth group members, when they come into the Episcopal Church? What are the barriers we kind of put up that we might not be aware of?
Now I get in trouble because my boss.
We need to hear this stuff.
So we chose the Episcopal Church, right? Okay, so we're here because we want to be here. We love you. We love us. One of my first experiences with the Episcopal Church in Texas was when I was hurt by one of those evangelical churches as a minister. It was a super dysfunctional church leadership. They just really hurt me. A mile from my house was a little Episcopal parish called St. Martin's in the Fields. I found out later that Bishop Marianne's sister had been worshiping there. I started going to the 7 a.m. Rite One service at that church. There was only ever 2 or 3 communicants and a priest. And I'd never been to an Episcopal church or service before. No music. It was straight Rite One, straight out of the book. And I got to tell you, I have recommended that to people in hurt places over the years because it was a cocoon of sacred space and word and healing that I needed at the time. I don't need that every Sunday. I don't need it often. I do enjoy it sometimes. But our liturgical rigidity, whether we're talking a Rite One service or a Rite Two, even if you type it up and put it in a bulletin and put some pretty pictures with it, that rigidity, our liturgy is a powerful strength. And my understanding of the word liturgy is that it grows out of a couple of words that basically mean the work of the people. The words come together. Liturgy is what we do. When we approach it with a rigidity that it cannot express someone else, liturgical rigidity just expressly says this cultural expression of Christianity is supreme and dominant and more important than another. So my question always is, if we really want to be a church for people who don't have a church, where are they coming from and how are they made at home and a part of this church that we would welcome them into? And so the liturgy needs to have some openness to that. I mean, I love it. I believe it. I cherish it. But I also really miss personal expression in worship at all. Any point in worship in which I'm me and not just a part of a system that someone else designed. And I mean, this is as simple as having an open mic prayers of the people time sometimes, instead of just reading off prayers and telling us what to say in response. It can be opening up preaching to more people so that they're involved, opening up music to more people, opening up music to multiple languages. And I don't mean singing in Spanish or French if it's not our language. I mean expressive ways to worship and do music. I didn't grow up with the organ in worship. In fact, I grew up in a cappella churches. Instruments were sinful. They sent you to hell. So my experience of the organ, yeah, that's the weird kind of evangelical conservatism I was in. My experience of organs were fun houses and carnivals and movies that featured fun houses and carnivals. The earliest kind of like memory of organ music that I could really muster and say, I really jammed to that organ is on the soundtrack to the 80s movies Lost Boys about vampires. It was not a part of church for me, and I don't know how to sing with it. Sometimes I kind of get the idea that I'm not expected to sing with it.
Right.
And so I can appreciate, and wow, can I appreciate the talent? We may have an organist in the group, and if so, I am so sorry, because you do know my boss. But you know, there's a time for the organ, and there's some amazing organ pieces, and I've been moved by them. But the fact that in the vast majority of my Episcopal church experience, no one has spoke my language musically. No one has really sung many of the songs I don't know if I've sung a song written in the past 20 years in
Right.
an Episcopal worship service since I joined the church. They're not all great, believe me. I've got major problems with some of the more recent hymnology and music and lyrics and stuff. I put my foot down in Bethesda. There's the one song that the line says something like, "Who has told every lightning bolt where to hit," or something like that. And I was like, whoa, guys, I grew up in Texas. Every other year, lightning struck a pole at a football game and killed a student. Okay, we got storms. That's
Right.
not part of my theology. So we nixed that song. But you know,
Uh-huh.
we have to be honest with ourselves that we have spent a lot of time setting up one cultural expression of worship as the dominant expression. And we have done everything we can do to make that good theology and to make that good exegesis. And it has left a lot of people without those contact points and connection points in worship.
Right.
From music to the words we use, to the first time I said, that this is our collect of the day, or I said the collect. We're going to pray the collect. And somebody at St. John's Norwood said, "Oh, who's not an Episcopalian?" Or something to that effect. Well, I wasn't, so I didn't
Sure.
know that we pronounce it in the Latinization of the word collect. So yeah, we need to work on that rigidity and kind of make
Uh-huh.
some entry
Uh-huh.
points for people, make our sponge a little more porous, so people get soaked in a little easier when they come
Yeah.
near us.
No, that's really helpful. So part of what you're saying is you had powerful, important spiritual experiences before in using different kinds of music and forms of
Mhm.
prayer than what we do. And it would be helpful to see a little bit of that in what we do on a regular basis. So that would be, I remember it was really helpful when you talked about thinking about people's receptors
Mhm.
at the church in Bethesda and how to connect with those receptors. So, you know, and that's could be part of a graciousness for a congregation to say, what are those things that people when they get here, they'll say, oh, I'm used to that. I've done that my
Mhm.
whole life. I know that this is also for people like me. And it can be hard when everything is from a very different cultural world to
Yeah.
see that.
And I love that word you use, gracious, that graciousness in it. Because I will say this too, because I've been around church and I've been around struggling church. I've been around church with generational battles. We don't have generational battles as much anymore because we don't have all the generations. But I've been around those worship wars. And I can tell you from my time as a youth pastor to my time as a pastor, senior pastor in Bethesda, um, every single time somebody would come up and be upset about the music, they'd say, all we sing are praise hymns, and we don't do the old hymns from the psalm book. And I would say, we do. And they say, yeah, but the vast majority is praise music. Or they'd come and they say, I'm sick of all these hymns. Why are we singing all these hymns? Our in Church of Bethesda, our theme song was "Come Thou Fount," and we sang it in about 6 different ways. But every single one of those situations, I knew because I did the reports from the bulletins and I did the worship planning and I was in on that. We split them half and half, but
Right.
it always felt like you were on the losing end when it was a battle.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
when it's a battle, I think we just have 2 losers. We have to change, reframe that.
Yeah.
And graciousness is the way to do it. That we really do want people to come in and maybe click. And it's not like they're walking in, they're here, and we open up with a Taylor Swift song, but we open up with instruments that they're accustomed to. We open up
Sure.
with easy to sing melodies. Y'all, these melodies in our hymn book kill me sometimes. I'm like, I have seen our hymns change time signatures from 3/4 to 2/2 to 9/8 or something. Impossible to sing with.
Yeah.
So we could do some work on that.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And I
Mhm.
think your boss would probably have a lot of sympathy with what you said. So, um, next week, the whole session we have is going to be talking about hybrid church and kind of what
Mhm.
kind of the word in the church world has becoming about this. But I'm curious for your thoughts about this. Lots of congregations right now, like ours, are operating as a kind of hybrid church with both an in-person presence and a digital presence through live streaming. But it seems to me that evangelical churches have like dived even further into all of this.
Mhm.
And I'm curious if you think that they have things to teach us about how to do this well and how to connect with people through digital means.
I think so. I mean, we have some questions to answer, some things to go forward with. Part of being an incarnational people, part of being a sacramental people, adds a dynamic of sacraments that those churches typically don't have to struggle with and answer within sacramental ministry like the Eucharist and consecration. But I will say, you think of Jesus at the beginning of the book of Acts and sending the apostles out to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth, and sending them out in this movement. What was Jesus doing? Jesus was sending people to where people were. And I think the reason that in general, the evangelical world had already been out there in so many ways in the digital world, the digital platforms, broadcasting and live streaming, is their ethos of being a sent people. And that is something I would really like the Episcopal Church to re-embrace and discover. That Jesus sent us. What would Jesus say today? Would he just say, go to Potomac and Darnestown and Gaithersburg? Or would Jesus say, go out into the computers and the phones and the internet and the digital platforms and be in your building, but also be in the parks? Worship at St. Francis, but go worship at a community center in Darnestown. Go find an empty lot and host a community egg hunt on Easter up in Germantown for folks who don't have a church. Where would we be sent? That ethos of being a sent people versus what has kind of culturally for an establishment church, it's really easy for us to become a people who are not sent, but kind of just sit and wait. And we can try to dress some things up and do some sparkly things to get people to come, but if we're just sitting and waiting, we're missing the ethos of going out and finding people, being sent, go to make disciples. So there's an ethos there that is fundamental to evangelical Christianity. Of course, it's been abused. Just like I love our liturgy, I love our lexicon, our lectionary. I love our liturgical year. Rigidity can make those things not work for people sometimes. That kind of ethos of being a sent people, when it starts off on the foot of, hey, y'all damned people, let me tell you what to do next. Let me save you. I grew up in that church. We were sent door to door knocking. When I was probably 10 years old, I knocked on a door and guy answered the door. And first question out of my mouth is, hey, I'm Todd. If you died today, would you go to heaven or hell? So we've all kind of like seen that happening, or we've seen it in weird movies and things. And that's definitely where we don't want to go. But to regain the ethos that Matthew 9, when Jesus sees people, sees their hurt and their pain, and says, the harvest is plentiful, pray that workers go. It's that compassion for people that drives us to take good news to them. I'd love for us to recapture that, and really, we would be rejuvenated by it. I was looking around in articles, and I found an article from the Diocese of Oklahoma that said the average Episcopalian invites someone to church once every 38 years. That kind of fits with some of the other statistics I've heard here and there and heard people quote. We just don't want to bother folks, but at some point the gospel calls us enough to love them enough to want to be with them. And so I think that's the ethos that drives the hybridization question. If the people are there, and we've experienced a momentous shift, yes, there's Zoom fatigue, but you cannot believe Zoom is going away anytime soon. Right. Zoom, Microsoft Teams, all the different ways, Google Meetup. Believe me, this has accelerated a shift that was already happening. So the question is, if there are people there, are we willing to be sent to them?
Fascinating. Thank you. Um, I had my last question for you was, I think in some ways you've answered it, but I'm curious how you would kind of pull it all together, which is that, if you could change three things about most Episcopal churches in our area, or maybe about St. Francis in particular, what would those three things be?
Oh, well, I don't know St. Francis, so you're off the hook. But we've talked about it a bit, and I'm going to frame it in the language of the 7 vital signs. I think that some of those vital signs, none of those vital signs represent quick fixes. Okay, go do this thing, and poof, you've got 1 million people, and your budget's balanced. What the vital signs do represent are focuses of value and practice. So let's start with welcoming and connecting ministries. I wish that every Episcopal church in our diocese, any Episcopal church in the world, any church that's got the gospel for people, would focus on what it means to value and prepare for the guest. And that is it. For some of our churches in our context, it's going to mean somebody's outside helping them find a place to park. It's helping them know what door to go to, because some of our buildings are really crazy, confusing, even from the outside, much less when you walk in, where do I go? It is to walk in and find a trained group of people, lay leaders. The priests can't do this. They're all praying and getting invested in doing stuff, who are there to say, welcome, so glad you're here. And to talk to them and get to know them and find out what their names are and let them know where to grab a seat and to make sure they got all the materials they need and they know about coffee hour. Make sure coffee hour is good. Okay, don't give them pickles and stale bagels and some coffee that the person without coffee talent made. Spend that time getting to know them and have ministries ready, have opportunities for them. If they've got kids with them, you got to have at least one thing to talk about with kids. If they've got teenagers with them, you got to have at least one thing to mention that the church is doing for teenagers. If they don't have kids, then you got to have something in your conversation with them. You need to have a couple of affinity groups in mind. They need to be listed out. And, when they walk in, they need to realize this church is not just about what we're about to do on Sunday morning, but it's about all of my life. And welcoming and connecting ministries are an area in which we could really grow a lot of us. I grew up in churches that when you walked in, the first thing you saw was a big tract display. And I've seen a couple of these in Episcopal churches, and they're fairly benign in the Episcopal churches where I've seen them, right? Alcohol addiction, drug addiction, what to do with this, if I need counseling. In the churches I grew up in, it was why I'm not a Baptist, why I'm not a Methodist, why I'm not a Catholic, why I'm not a Mormon, okay? We've all got room to grow here. But if people could walk in and the first thing they see is welcome, a big welcome sign, and people who said, I am so glad to meet you, so glad you're here, and sort of unselfishly had the attitude of, I wonder what they're going to bring to our community if they stay. Why has God brought them to us? Value them that way is really exciting. Welcoming and connecting ministries, that inviting and uplifting worship is one of the other vital signs. And that's where I really would like us to rethink some of our liturgical rigidity around forms and methods and kind of break those out. And it may be that it's creating a brand new service to complement other services happening. It's totally fine. It may mean going out and creating a new service in a new space. What we do there is we create different front doors for people, so that we don't expect, architecturally, we tend to make one big, beautiful front door, right? And we expect everybody to just know that's the front door, funnel in there. We have to, in worship, and we have to in our community, to bring people in and get them established. They have to be able to find some easy egress into our building. They have to find those on-ramps and doors, and it's not going to be one. It's not going to be one. Don't take the organ out, because there are some times when it is amazing. But maybe make some room for some other worship expression in prayers, in music. Do a little something different in preaching. talk to the bishop, whatever you want to do, but get a dispensation to sort of move off the lectionary for a time when it matters to the world around us, so that we're really intersecting in worship with life outside of our building, life every day. So that when people come in, they're enlivened by that intersection of faith and the anxieties and the concerns and the interests that they have on a day-to-day basis. Let me see if I would pick 3 of those top vital signs. And they do begin to overlap and they begin to blur together. Oh, and by the way, I will say on that welcoming and connecting ministries, we're not off the hook during the pandemic. If I go to your website and the first thing I see is a button to donate money, I'm gonna leave your website. Okay, I say that a lot when I talk to folks in our diocese. It needs to be images of people. Okay, it needs to be the word welcome. Don't put the language of a collect up on it. Just give a welcome. Talk about joy, talk about love, talk about God, talk about community. Don't show a picture of an empty altar or an empty church front. Show the people, even if it's them at a cookout. Let folks know that that's really what we're focused on. The third thing, if I had a wish list for the churches, I guess I'd land on that inspiring and capable leadership. And what we're talking about on that vital sign is that we're really developing our people to lead, to grow. It really focuses heavily because there's not a lot, honestly, you can do about your clergy, right? Your clergy need to be cared for. You need to be stretching and growing, right? And there probably needs to be a group of people really concerned with that, helping you be your best. But also inspiring and capable leadership exists across our parishes. And one thing the pandemic has taught us, the pandemic activated all these people. I was talking to a leader from one parish, had no idea that they had several folks retired from the TV industry in their parish, broadcast people who know all about camera and lighting and audio and all this stuff. And guess where they had never been activated? At church. For those gifts and abilities. So develop those leaders, work with people, really. It kind of overlaps with that clear path of discipleship, but think about the leadership potential. And remember that scripture identifies a lot of different kinds of leaders. Paul said the Spirit gives the church prophets and pastors and apostles and teachers and evangelists. So there's leadership and ministry of pastoral care, of prophetic voice, of teaching, and of all different kinds of ministry. And we need to make sure that we're tapping folks into that potential in them, so that welcoming and connecting ministries have something to connect people to. We're an active community of people, and folks can find their place within that community.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful. Thank you so much. I would ask, you said your wife is there with you. I'm curious if she wants to add anything to what you've said. I don't know if she likes to go on camera or not, but
in other words, what would you correct, love, on what you've been hearing me say?
I am so not dressed for church today, and I apologize.
That's okay. No, that's fine.
Yeah, the one thing I was thinking I wished that I had in the Episcopal Church.
Oh, can y'all hear her?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay, good. Is a translator.
Interesting.
All the language is different. All the ways you walk in the way you go up for communion, that's always a mess. I think of it as like if I was going to an Armenian Orthodox church, and the language is all different, and the everything is written differently in the bulletin that I'm used to, and just to say, now is the collect of the day. That's because that's for this, and then you go into it, or the now is the Eucharist, which is when we share communion, and we're all going to walk this way, and we're all going to come back that way, and
sure.
And even the people who are there every Sunday, that is sort of there's a comfort in reiterating why we do these things. But just that I am still lost. What the different name for all the pieces of vestments. I don't need that every Sunday, but it's all a whole different language, and coming in as an outsider, it is othering. to not know what's
Right.
going on, just in simply the words. So
Right.
just a short translation along the way would make me feel way more welcome.
Would be really
Don't
helpful.
take for granted that your people know all that stuff. The
So-
early time in the Episcopal
That
Church,
too.
we taught an 8th and 9th grade class, and those students have been in the Episcopal Church their whole lives, most of them. They had no idea why we passed the feast, what connections theologically or biblically there are for the different things we do. They had no clue what things were called, why they just did it because
Right.
that's what they were told to do. So yeah, we take a lot for granted.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I don't know your name. I'm sorry. I should have.
Teresa.
Teresa. Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. Great. That's really helpful. I'm going to open things up. If any of you have questions for Father Todd or for Teresa, for that matter, and you want to
Right.
share some reflections, or you want to know more about something, just speak up. Unmute yourself and speak up.
Good morning, Father Todd.
Good morning.
I did have one question for you. Given your having spent time in the evangelical church and then coming to the Episcopal church, one thing that we have been working on is bringing in more younger families. And I can see within what you said today how we might reach out and attract more of them. And a question I have for you is if you could speak specifically to that issue in terms of how we might create a more, if I'm correctly using your terminology, and pardon me if I'm not, but a relevant space for them within our church, a more relevant space, so that it's, there's a connection.
Yeah. Thank you. And is it Renita?
Yes.
Awesome. Renita, thank you for that question. Yeah, churches have got to grow young, and that is across the board for Episcopal churches, evangelical churches. I was asked to come talk to a church vestry a little while back. I was asked out as my role as missioner because they wanted to do away with their children's ministry because they didn't have any kids. So they're like, we want to feel justified in this, and they said we don't see kids around our community. So basically, I was asked to come out and give them the rationale for doing away with children's ministries. Well, I ran all the demographic studies on their area, and sure enough, in the community across the street from them, there were not kids. The community that they were a part of on their side of the street was jam-packed with kids. I drove up to the building, and there's a park with a park center within inside of their church building. I'm like, are y'all kidding? It is tough to build from scratch, but we have got to be serious about the kids we have and the kids who are going to come to us. I will say I've been pretty shocked at the lack of theological direction and emphasis put on youth ministry within the Episcopal Church. You can point to some things happening nationally. You can point to some people who are passionate, but youth group was super important in the churches that we grew up in. They were given resources, they were given time, they were given leaders. My wife's moving in.
I'm passionate about this one.
They were valued and it showed.
The churches I grew up in, we had an elementary school minister full-time, a junior high minister, and a senior high minister. And there were activities Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday evening, at least, usually every weekend. And it wasn't just about activities. And it wasn't just a play. It was that hard theological work as well. But, you don't have to have a full-time priest for it, but somebody who's really focused on it. Those are the places where the young are really vibrant. And when you say young people, that's depending on your view, 40 down. I mean, how young are you talking when you say young people? Because that's a whole other, how do you get 25-year-olds in is very, very different. Similar, but very different.
And I would say with kids, they need to have their own community. They need to understand. They need to know one another. They need to spend time together. As the youth pastor in Alabama, in a more conservative church, I was expected to make sure they could all quote scripture. But I'm like, I would rather them want to hang out together, because that is how community is formed. That's how faith really gets in to people. And we came from a lot of different schools. We didn't all go to one school. It wasn't that kind of a rural or suburban area. It was a little more urban in Montgomery. lots of different areas they came from. So we made time for them to be together and learn how to do that. I have not seen that kind of a group in an Episcopal church yet, where the kids hang out together because they want to outside of church and time and class.
They tried it. They were close at St. John's.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to,
Close next-
believe me, and that's more than just a trip a summer,
Sure,
honestly.
That is investment. Yeah. I
Yeah.
think that's what, if you can, even if it ends up being Ginchi, if you can tell a church is investing in you where you see yourself, I think it makes you want to be there.
Because kids will bring their friends, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
If they like hanging out together, they're going to bring their friends, and their friends will not all be churched. Our biggest growth when I was youth pastor in Alabama was the unchurched kids who would get invited along. And you'll find this with adults too. We do a lot of funny looking stuff in church. I mean, Father Mark, you and I wear dresses, that we don't wear anywhere else, and all this stuff. And we have all this language. And those kids would come and they would sit in our youth group and they'd laugh at our songs, especially the kind of goofy songs that we sang, and they'd cut up during the Bible reading. But when it came to prayer time, they were like locked on to us, and they're opening up about their parents' addictions, about their problems in school, their relationships. And in our prayer life, we tracked not only requests, but we tracked answered prayers. And so they got to see efficacy. They got to see the impact it had on that community of kids, and they wanted to be a part of it. If we're creating community like that, you almost can't help but grow.
Yeah, it's not comfy. It's not comfy
Yeah.
to bring in others to whom you have to translate everything you're doing. It's not comfy, but it's powerful.
No, it's really helpful. Other questions or comments from the group?
I just want to thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts with us. This has been, I think, very helpful for those of us who were able to hear what you've said in response to Father Mark's really helpful questions. So I just wanted to thank you. And I'm also curious where you both attend church.
Oh yeah, thank you, Gail. Well, we pre-pandemic were attending at St. James Potomac. We had ended up there during the last year of my preparation for the general ordination exams, as I was wrapping up my postulancy, and then we did our deacon time there. And then honestly, since the pandemic, the online church experience doesn't really do much for us as Gen Xers.
And you're doing this at a different church every Sunday. So.
Yeah, and so I was actually I was super blessed. I got to do supply for St. George's Glendale all through Lent and up into Easter Sunday, as their rector was dealing with some medical stuff. So we tend to drop in the coffee hour at St. James on Sunday mornings and keep in touch with folks there. And then I am often about at different times, different churches, and so we drop in when we can.
And so you often attend those Zoom services or the streaming services like you did ours today, which gives you great exposure to what's going on in the diocese.
Right, and and St. James Potomac doesn't do live worship. I don't know if you've ever noticed, they do full pre-recorded. So we'll pop up in that sometimes because we'll record our pieces and parts for that on Thursday and send it in. But so I'll catch some of their premiere videos when they launch. But for that community right now, for us, it's really been the coffee hours over Zoom that have been the most impactful.
I shouldn't have asked such a personal question, but
Oh,
I was just curious where you were finding nourishment during this time, given your background, which I thought was very interesting. So thank you.
Yeah,
That's a good question. Well, unless someone else has a question or a comment, I will thank you for being with us today. It's been a really fascinating and helpful discussion, a lot of really useful insights. I've recorded it and we'll share it with the rest of the vestry and certainly with others who I think could really benefit from learning from what you've shared with us. And for those of you who are St. Francis folks, next week,